In the darkest corners of the galaxy, where mercy is a luxury and compassion is weakness, one species has been hunted to near extinction for their most precious gift, their ability to heal any wound, cure any disease, with just a touch. The Kithara, gentle beings who once saved countless lives across 1,000 worlds, now hide in terror as poachers sell their body parts to the highest bidder. But when a human mechanic with calloused hands and a broken ship stumbles into their nightmare, the hunters are about to discover why humanity earned its reputation as the galaxy's most dangerous protectors. The emergency klaxons screamed their dying song as Zara Kowalski fought with the controls of her cargo hauler, Lucky Strike. Sparks cascaded from overhead panels like deadly fireworks, while the smell of burning electronics filled the cramped cockpit. Through the cracked viewport, she watched the unknown planet's surface rush up to meet her with terrifying speed. "Come on, you piece of junk," she muttered, coaxing every last bit of power from the failing engines. Her hands, permanently stained with grease and marked by countless burns from hot metal, danced across the control panel with practiced precision. 23 years of fixing broken things had taught her that sometimes the gentlest touch could save what brute force would destroy. The impact came like a giant's fist, throwing her against the safety harness hard enough to crack ribs. The ship bounced twice, carved a deep furrow through purple grass, and, finally, came to rest against a cluster of crystal formations that chimed like broken bells in the alien wind. Silence fell like a heavy blanket. Zara hung in her harness, tasting blood, and inventory her injuries. Bruised ribs, split lip, possibly a concussion, but nothing fatal. She'd walked away from worse crashes, though not many. The Lucky Strike had earned its name through 17 years of improbable survival, but their luck might have finally run out. Emergency power bathed everything in hellish red light. The main engines were dead, along with faster-than-light communications and the navigation array. Life support showed green, but for how long? The nearest space lane was 3 systems away, and her last distress beacon had been fried when the ship's computer core overloaded somewhere near the Vega Nebula. Zara unbuckled her harness and stumbled to the rear cargo bay. The crash had scattered her tools and spare parts across the deck like metal confetti, but the emergency kit remained secure in its mounting bracket. She grabbed the medical supplies, a water purifier, and her grandfather's old plasma cutter, a tool old enough to be an antique but reliable as sunrise. The planet's air registered as breathable, though thin and carrying strange scents that reminded her of ozone and flowers. 2 pale suns hung in a lavender sky, casting everything in soft, dreamlike light. The landscape stretched away in rolling hills covered by that peculiar purple grass, broken by groves of trees whose leaves shifted color with the changing breeze. It was beautiful. It was also completely unmarked on any star chart in her ship's database, which meant she'd crashed somewhere in the outer rim, the lawless frontier where corporate oversight ended, and only the strong or clever survived. Zara spent the first hour conducting damage assessment. The main drive was completely fried, its magnetic containment field collapsed, and the fusion chamber cracked beyond repair. The backup generators could keep life support running for maybe 10 days. The communications array was so much twisted metal and melted circuitry. Even if she cannibalized every spare part on board, she didn't have the materials to repair the critical systems. She was stranded. The thought should have terrified her, but Zara had learned long ago that panic was just another kind of system failure. You diagnosed the problem, identified available resources, and worked the solution one step at a time. Survival was just another engineering challenge. As afternoon faded toward evening, she heard the sound, a soft whimpering that barely carried over the wind. It was the kind of sound that any creature made when pain became too much to bear in silence. Zara followed it to a shallow depression, perhaps 50 meters from her ship, where the purple grass grew thicker around a small spring of crystalline water. What she found there changed everything. The child couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old by human standards, though clearly not human. Its skin held a faint luminescence, like moonlight on pale water, and delicate antennae twitched weakly above large eyes the color of deep forest pools. Most striking were the hands, too many fingers, each tipped with what looked like mother-of-pearl, and even unconscious, they seemed to glow with their own inner light. The child had been shot. The energy burn across its shoulder was precise, calculated. Someone had wanted to disable, not kill. Its breathing came in shallow gasps, and the luminescence in its skin flickered like a candle in wind. Zara had seen plenty of suffering in the freight yards and salvage stations where she'd learned her trade. She'd patched up dock workers caught in industrial accidents, treated laser burns from pirates who didn't check their targets carefully enough, and once spent 6 hours performing surgery on a man who'd been nearly cut in half by a malfunctioning cargo loader. But something about this child's pain cut deeper than usual. She knelt beside the small form and gently touched its uninjured shoulder. The skin felt warm, almost electric, and the child's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they stared at each other across the vast gulf between species, human and alien, stranger and stranger. "Hey there," Zara said softly, the way she might speak to a frightened animal. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Zara." The child's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Its free hand reached toward her, and those pearl-tipped fingers brushed against her wrist. The moment they made contact, Zara felt something impossible, a warmth that flowed up her arm and somehow conveyed meaning without words. Pain, fear, hunters, family gone, alone. The emotional download hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a lost child. It was a refugee, a survivor of something terrible. And somehow, through that brief touch, she felt its desperation as clearly as her own heartbeat. "Hunters," she repeated, and the child's antennae twitched in what might have been acknowledgement. "Someone's hunting your people." Zara looked around the peaceful landscape with new eyes. Those crystal formations could hide sensor readings. The thick grass would muffle footsteps. This wasn't just a random crash site. It was a hiding place, and she'd stumbled into someone else's nightmare. The child needed medical attention beyond her basic first aid knowledge, but something told her that moving toward any populated area would be exactly the wrong choice. Instead, she gathered the small form as gently as possible and carried it back to her ship. The Lucky Strike might be grounded, but its hull was solid, and its sensor array, while damaged, might still detect approaching threats. She laid the child on her own bunk and did what she could with her medical supplies. The energy burn was clean but deep, and standard human painkillers might not work on alien physiology. As she worked, the child drifted in and out of consciousness, and each time those pearl-tipped fingers touched her skin, she caught fragments of its experience. Ships in the sky. That's that burn. People screaming. Running. Always running. "Were they hunting you for?" she asked, though she didn't expect an answer. This time, when the child's fingers brushed her hand, the response came not in emotions, but in images. She saw those same pearl-tipped hands touching injured animals and watching wounds close instantly. She saw them pressed against diseased plants that bloomed back to health. She saw a people whose very touch could heal anything, cure everything, restore life to the dying. And she saw other images, cages full of the child's people, their hands severed and kept alive in stasis chambers, sold to wealthy collectors who could afford immortality. She saw laboratories where their blood was processed in a medicine that could cure any disease. She saw hunters who tracked them across the galaxy like animals, selling them piece by piece to the highest bidder. The Kithra, that was their name, she realized, pulled from the child's traumatic memories. Healers who had once been welcomed on every civilized world, now hunted to near extinction because their gift was too valuable to leave them in control of it. Zara sat back on her heels, feeling sick. She'd heard rumors in the outer stations. whispered stories of a miracle cure that could restore youth, heal any injury, cure any poison. She'd assumed it was just another black market myth, like the supposed cache of ancient weapons or the planet made entirely of precious metals. She'd been wrong. The miracle cure was real, and it came at the cost of genocide. The child stirred, and this time its eyes focused clearly on her face. When it spoke, the words came in accented but understandable standard. "You not hunter?" "No," Zara said firmly. "I'm just a mechanic. My ship crashed, and I found you hurt." "Mechanic." The child tested the word carefully. "You fix broken things?" "That's right. Engines, computers, life support systems. Anything mechanical." The child's eyes widened slightly. "Can you fix broken people?" The question hit harder than the emotional download had. Here was a child whose entire species faced extermination, asking a stranger if she could somehow repair the damage that greed and cruelty had inflicted. Zara thought about the hunters out there, the ships full of cages, the laboratories where healing hands were harvested like crops. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I can sure as hell try." The child closed its eyes, and for the first time since she'd found it, the lines of pain in its face eased slightly. "My name, Kef." "Hello, Kef. Like I said, I'm Zara." She adjusted the child's blankets and checked the improvised bandages on his shoulder. "How many of your people are out there?" "Hidden, I mean." "Few. Very few." Kef's voice carried a weight no child should bear. "Others taken to the ships. Or worse." Zara felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. She'd spent her entire adult life fixing broken things, coaxing life back into dead engines, and finding ways to make impossible repairs work just long enough to matter. But this was bigger than any machine, more complex than any system she'd ever tried to restore. This was about survival, justice, and the simple human principle that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. As night fell on the alien world, casting everything in silver starlight, Zara made her decision. The lucky strike was grounded indefinitely, but that didn't mean she was helpless. She had tools, knowledge, and 23 years of experience making the impossible work. More importantly, she had something the hunters weren't expecting, a human who'd just learned that sometimes the most important repair job was fixing what other people had broken. Outside, something howled in the distance. It might have been a native predator, or it might have been something worse. Kef stirred restlessly at the sound, antennae twitching with instinctive fear. Zara checked her grandfather's plasma cutter and began planning modifications to her ship's defensive systems. If the hunters came looking for Kef, they'd find more than a lost child and a stranded mechanic. They'd find out why humans had a reputation for being dangerously protective of things they cared about. 3 days passed before the hunters came. Zara had used the time well, turning her crippled ship into something approaching a fortress. The cargo bay doors were reinforced with salvage hull plating, and she'd rigged motion sensors from the navigation array to create an early warning system. Her grandfather's plasma cutter had been mounted on an improvised turret that could rotate to cover the ship's blind spots. Kef recovered faster than seemed possible, the energy burn on its shoulder closing to a thin silver line within 48 hours. The child's natural healing was remarkable, but it came with a cost. Each restoration depleted the soft glow in its skin, leaving it pale and exhausted until rest recharged whatever biological process made the Kithra so precious to their hunters. On the second morning, Kef had led her to a hidden cave system about a kilometer from the crash site. The caves were natural formations in the planet's crystalline bedrock, but they'd been carefully modified with concealed entrances and ventilation shafts that emerged disguised among the crystal outcroppings on the surface. Inside, Zara found 12 more Kithra. They were the remnants of a larger group that had been hiding on this nameless world for almost a year, ever since their transport ship was destroyed while trying to reach one of the few remaining sanctuary colonies. The survivors ranged from elderly individuals whose skin glowed like starlight to children barely old enough to walk. All of them bore the particular wariness of prey animals, eyes that never stopped moving, voices that carried no further than necessary, and hands that trembled at unexpected sounds. Veth was their informal leader, an adult whose antennae had been partially severed in some past encounter with hunters. Unlike Kef, who spoke decent standard, Veth communicated primarily through the touch telepathy that seemed natural to their species. When Zara first met the group, Veth had touched her hand briefly and somehow conveyed weeks of information in an instant. Ship destroyed over Kepler Station. 47 people aboard. 12 survived planetfall. Food sources identified. Water pure. Hunters search nearby systems, waiting for rescue that may never come. Asterisk, the emotional weight of their situation was overwhelming. These people, and Zara had quickly begun thinking of them as people, regardless of their alien appearance, were trapped between slow starvation and violent capture. The planet's ecosystem could support them indefinitely, but they had no way to contact potential allies or travel to safer regions of the galaxy. Why this world? Zara had asked through Kef, who could translate her words into the touch language his people preferred. The answer came in fragments. Shared memories passed from one Kithera to another until the story emerged. The planet was listed in corporate databases as barren and resource-poor, making it an unlikely target for development or regular patrols. Its distance from major shipping lanes meant that traffic was minimal. Most importantly, the unique crystalline formations interfered with long-range sensors, creating natural blind spots where small groups could hide indefinitely. It was a perfect refuge, except for one problem. The hunters had eventually found them anyway. On the third night, Zara's improvised motion sensors screamed their electronic warning. She'd been in the caves when the alarm reached her through a hastily rigged communication line. The Kithera around her froze like small animals sensing a predator, their collective luminescence dimming to almost nothing. In the sudden darkness, only their eyes remained visible, wide pools of fear that reflected the faint light from her handheld torch. "How many ships?" she asked Kef, who was already reaching for her hand. The touch contact came with images pulled from the minds of watchers stationed near the cave entrances. 2 vessels, sleek and predatory, had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. They were running dark, their emissions shielded, and their approach vectors calculated to avoid the planet's small automated monitoring station. Hunter ships, built for stealth and speed, equipped with capture nets that could disable without killing, and crewed by beings who viewed intelligent life as nothing more than valuable cargo. "They know you're here," Zara said, and felt the ripple of terror that passed through the group. "The question is how much they know." Veth moved close enough to touch her arm, and the contact brought a flood of desperate planning. The caves had multiple exits, emergency supplies cached throughout the tunnel system, and predetermined rally points if the group needed to scatter. But running would only delay the inevitable. The hunters had tracking technology that could follow bioelectric signatures across continents, and their ship sensors would map every cave system on the planet within hours. This wasn't a raid. It was the endgame of a hunt that had lasted nearly a year. Zara felt that familiar cold certainty settle in her chest. She'd spent 3 days learning about these people, watching parents comfort frightened children, seeing the way they shared resources without question and offered healing touches to ease each other's pain. They were refugees who'd already lost everything once and were facing the same fate again. "No," she said aloud, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "No more running." The Kithera stared at her in confusion. Through Kef, she felt their questions. Asterisk, what do you mean? How can we fight? We are not warriors. Asterisk, you don't have to be warriors, Zara replied, already moving toward the cave entrance. You just have to trust me to be one for you. The next hour was controlled chaos. Zara's ship's sensors showed the hunter vessels conducting systematic sweeps of the planet's surface, their search patterns slowly tightening around the crystal formation where the caves were hidden. They were being careful, methodical, using passive sensors to avoid alerting any potential prey to their presence. That caution would be their downfall. Zara worked with desperate efficiency, pulling components from her ship's damaged systems and combining them with tools from her emergency kit. What she built wasn't elegant, but it would serve her purpose. A signal amplifier cobbled together from communication equipment, broadcasting on frequencies that would appear to be natural electromagnetic interference to anyone not looking closely. But to someone who understood the patterns, it was a message. She'd learned the frequency signatures of the hunter ships from her observations over the past hour. More importantly, she'd identified the command codes they used to coordinate their search pattern. It had taken her grandfather's old signal analyzer and 3 attempts to crack their encryption, but the breakthrough was worth it. If you could read their communications, you could spoof them. The first hunter ship was conducting a detailed scan of the crystal formations when Zara's improvised transmitter came online. To its crew, it looked like their sister ship was reporting a confirmed contact 15 kilometers away. Multiple bioelectric signatures consistent with a Kithra hiding spot, accompanied by what appeared to be communication equipment that suggested a potential rescue vessel. The ship broke off its search pattern and raced toward the false contact at maximum atmospheric speed. That left one hunter vessel still circling the area, but its crew was now spread thin as they tried to cover their partner's abandoned search grid. Zara waited until the ship's patrol route brought it directly over her position, then activated the second part of her plan. The Lucky Strike's main engines were dead, but their magnetic containment systems were still functional. Zara had spent the previous day recalibrating them to create a focused electromagnetic pulse, not powerful enough to destroy a ship, but more than sufficient to overload unshielded sensor arrays and communication equipment. When the hunter vessel passed directly overhead, she triggered the pulse. The ship's lights flickered, its search beams cut out, and its smooth flight pattern dissolved into an awkward wobble as backup systems fought to compensate for the sudden system's failure. In the confusion, it took the crew several minutes to realize they'd been deliberately targeted. By then, Zara was already moving. She'd borrowed a piece of Kithra biotechnology, a suit of living armor that one of the adults had been wearing when their transport was destroyed. It wasn't designed for humans, but Kef had shown her how to interface with its control systems using direct skin contact. The suit's camouflage capabilities were impressive, bending light around the wearer to create near-perfect invisibility. More importantly, it was equipped with a personal shield generator powerful enough to deflect small arms fire. Zara crossed the distance to the grounded hunter ship in 17 minutes, moving through the crystal formations like a ghost. The ship had landed to conduct repairs, its crew working frantically to restore their sensor array before their partner returned from the wild goose chase she'd sent them on. There were 4 hunters, 2 working on external repairs, 1 coordinating from the pilot station, and 1 guarding a cargo hold that undoubtedly contained capture equipment designed specifically for Kithra prey. Zara studied them through the suit's heads-up display, noting their equipment and positions. The hunters were professional, well-armed, and completely focused on their technical problems. They'd never fought an enemy who struck from invisibility, and they'd certainly never faced a human mechanic who decided that some machines needed to be broken rather than fixed. Her grandfather's plasma cutter had been modified with a focused beam setting that could slice through hull plating like paper. Zara used it to create a series of precise cuts in the ship's engine housing, severing fuel lines and control cables with surgical precision. The damage wouldn't be immediately obvious, but when the crew tried to take off, their drive system would suffer catastrophic failure. The 2 repair technicians never knew what hit them. Zara's stunner, another piece of salvaged equipment, dropped them unconscious in their tracks. She was already moving toward the ship's entrance when shouts from inside indicated that someone had noticed their missing team members. The guard at the cargo hold was faster than she'd expected, spinning toward the entrance with a military-grade pulse rifle that could have burned through her borrowed armor. But Zara had spent 23 years working in environments where a moment's inattention could be fatal. Her reflexes were honed by years of dodging industrial equipment and handling volatile materials. She was inside his effective range before he could properly aim, and Her stunner put him down before he could adjust his targeting. The pilot was shouting into his communication system, trying to raise the other hunter's ship and getting only static in response. Zara's electromagnetic pulse had done more damage than she'd planned, apparently overloading their long-range communications as well as their sensors. When he finally noticed her, it was too late. "You're trespassing on a legal salvage operation," the pilot said, his hands slowly moving away from his weapons. He was human, she realized, or close enough that the distinction didn't matter. "Whoever you are, you don't want to interfere with corporate business." "Corporate business," Zara repeated, her voice muffled by the armor's breathing system. "Is that what you call hunting children?" Something shifted in the pilot's expression, and she could see him reassessing the situation. A lone human with alien technology, moving like someone trained in combat, appearing out of nowhere to attack a hunter crew. In his experience, that usually meant one thing. "You're not just some random Good Samaritan," he said slowly. "You're working with them. The Kithra have hired protection." "Wrong again," Zara replied, and stunned him before he could reach the emergency beacon that would summon backup from corporate headquarters. The cargo hold was exactly what she'd expected, and worse. Capture nets that delivered neural disruption charges, containment cells designed to hold conscious prisoners without allowing them to use their healing abilities, and medical equipment obviously intended for live harvesting operations. Seeing it in person made her decision easier. Zara spent the next 20 minutes conducting the most thorough sabotage operation of her career. Every system on the ship was carefully disabled, not destroyed, but broken in ways that would require extensive repair at a properly equipped facility. The navigation computers were corrupted with recursive virus programs. The life support systems were recalibrated to create uncomfortable but non-fatal atmospheric conditions. The weapons were disabled by the simple expedient of removing key components and scattering them across the landscape. By the time the second hunter ship returned from its fruitless search, its partner vessel was completely inoperable, and its crew was locked in their own cargo hold, experiencing exactly the same conditions they'd planned to inflict on their prisoners. The second ship's crew was more cautious, circling their grounded partner at a safe distance while trying to establish communications. When that failed, they attempted a rescue landing, only to have their approach disrupted by carefully placed electromagnetic pulses that sent them into an uncontrolled spin. Their ship came down hard, carving a furrow through the purple grass and ending up tilted at a 40-degree angle against a crystal formation. The crew survived, but their vessel was no longer capable of atmospheric flight, let alone interstellar travel. As dawn broke over the alien landscape, Zara stood among the wreckage of 2 hunter ships and felt something she'd never experienced before. Not satisfaction at a job well done. This was deeper, more fundamental. It was the feeling of having fixed something that truly mattered. Kef found her there as the first of the pale suns crested the horizon, the child moving carefully through the crystal formations until it stood beside her. When their hands touched, the emotional contact was different than before. Instead of fear or pain, she felt something warm and complex that took her a moment to identify. "Hope. The others want to know," Kef said aloud, its standard improving with every conversation they had. "What happens now?" "More hunters will come when these do not return." Zara looked at the disabled ships, thinking about their communication logs and navigation data. The corporate sponsors who funded these hunting expeditions kept careful records of their investments. When 2 expensive vessels failed to report in, they'd send investigators. "Let them come," she said, surprising herself again with the certainty in her voice. "By the time they get here, we'll be ready." She had work to do, ships to repair, weapons to build, and a group of refugees to transform into something their enemies weren't prepared to face. The hunters had made one critical mistake in their calculations. They'd assumed that humans were just another species to be cataloged and dismissed. They'd never considered the possibility that humanity's greatest strength wasn't technology or weapons, but their inexplicable tendency to adopt lost causes and fight for them with everything they had. The Kithra were about to discover what it meant to have humans on their side. And the hunters were about to learn why that was a very dangerous thing to be on the wrong side of. The communication logs from the hunter ships told a story more horrifying than anything Zara had imagined. She'd spent 2 weeks extracting data from their computers, piecing together fragments of encrypted messages and corporate communications to understand the scope of the hunting operations. What she found wasn't just isolated poaching. It was systematic genocide disguised as business. The Kithara had once numbered in the millions, spread across dozens of worlds throughout the Outer Rim. Their healing abilities had made them welcome everywhere, serving as doctors, veterinarians, and biological restoration specialists. Some had even worked with terraforming companies, using their gifts to accelerate the adaptation of ecosystems on new colony worlds. Then, someone had figured out that you didn't need a living Kithara to benefit from their abilities. The first breakthrough had come from a medical research station on Titan 7, where scientists discovered that Kithara tissue could be harvested and preserved in stasis indefinitely. A single hand, kept alive in a biosuspension chamber, could heal hundreds of patients. Blood samples could be processed into universal medicines that cured everything from cancer to genetic disorders. Even their bone marrow contained compounds that could restore cellular damage caused by aging. The research had been intended to help the Kithara expand their healing reach, allowing them to save lives across the galaxy without being physically present. Instead, it had signed their species' death warrant. Within 5 years, corporate hunting fleets were scouring the galaxy for Kithara settlements. The hunts were disguised as voluntary relocation programs and medical research partnerships, but the reality was butchery on an industrial scale. Entire communities were captured, processed, and sold to wealthy clients who could afford immortality. The survivors, perhaps 10,000 individuals scattered across hundreds of worlds, lived in constant terror, hiding in places like this unnamed planet while hunters tracked them with the patience of apex predators. Zara printed the most damning documents and spread them across the floor of her makeshift workshop, studying shipping manifests that listed living beings as biological resources and financial reports that calculated profit margins based on harvested tissue mass. The cold bureaucracy of it made her feel sick, but she needed to understand her enemy before she could defeat them. "The scale is too big," she told Veth during one of their planning sessions. The Kithara leader had become her primary collaborator, their touch communication allowing for complex strategic discussions that would have taken hours to conduct through verbal translation. This isn't just one corporate division or a handful of rogue hunters. It's an entire industry. Through their mental link, Veth shared memories from before the hunts began. Markets where Kithara healers worked alongside doctors from a dozen species. Research stations where their people collaborated with human scientists to develop new medical techniques. Children playing in mixed-species schools, their gifts seen as blessings rather than commodities. All of it was gone now, swept away by greed and the simple biological reality that dead Kithara were more profitable than living ones. But the communication logs contained more than just evidence of genocide. They also revealed the structure of the hunting network, the corporate entities that funded it, and, most importantly, the locations where captured Kithara were being held. 17 processing stations scattered across 6 systems, each one a heavily fortified facility where living beings were systematically dismantled for their valuable parts. According to the most recent reports, nearly 3,000 Kithara were being held in various stages of what the corporate documents euphemistically called biological resource extraction. "We have to do something," Zara said aloud, knowing that Veth could feel her emotional turmoil through their connection. "I can't just sit here knowing that thousands of your people are trapped in those places. What can 12 refugees and 1 human do against an entire corporate fleet?" The question came with overtones of hopelessness that made Zara's chest tight. Veth was right, of course. The forces arrayed against them were overwhelming: corporate security teams, military contractors, and the backing of galactic commerce laws that classified Kithara as exploitable biological resources rather than sentient beings. But Zara had learned something important during her weeks of studying the hunter communications. The corporations running this operation had one critical weakness. They were businesses first and military organizations second. Their security was designed to prevent escapes and deter small-scale rescue attempts, not to withstand systematic sabotage by someone who understood their infrastructure. "We don't fight their fleet," she explained, her hands moving across salvage components as she spoke. "We break their supply chain." Over the following days, she outlined her plan. The processing stations were isolated facilities that depended on regular supply runs for food, medical equipment, and replacement machinery. More importantly, they relied on data links to corporate headquarters for operational coordination and financial transactions. If those links were severed, if supply ships were disabled, if critical systems began failing at precisely coordinated moments, even the most heavily defended facility would become vulnerable. It would require infiltration, technical expertise, and perfect timing. It would also require allies that they didn't currently have. "The first step is information," Zara told the assembled Kithara. She'd rigged a translation device that converted her words into the touch language they preferred, allowing her to address the entire group simultaneously. "We need to find other survivors, other refugees who are hiding throughout the region. If we're going to strike at multiple targets simultaneously, we need more than 12 people." The response was immediate and unanimous. It was too dangerous. The corporate hunters had infiltration protocols specifically designed to identify Kithara communication networks. Any attempt to contact other survivor groups would risk exposing everyone to capture. Zara understood their fear, but she also understood something they didn't. She was human, which meant she could go places and make contacts that would be impossible for a Kithara refugee. "Give me 2 weeks," she said. "I'll take one of the hunter's ships and modify it to look like a legitimate salvage vessel." Corporate traffic is common in this sector. One more human trader won't attract attention. The plan was risky to the point of insanity. She would be flying alone, using forged credentials to gain access to stations and facilities where corporate hunters might recognize her ship or detect traces of Kithara technology. But it was also the only way to build the network they needed. Kef volunteered to come with her, the young Kithara arguing that their people would be more likely to trust a rescuer who brought one of their own as proof of good intentions. The logic was sound, but the risk was enormous. If they were captured, Kef would face a fate worse than death, and Zara would be executed as a terrorist. "I go alone," she decided, but softened the rejection with a promise. "If I find other survivors, if this works, then we'll need you as a liaison when the real operation begins." The hunter ship she chose was the smaller of the 2 vessels, a fast courier designed for stealth rather than heavy combat. Zara spent 10 days stripping out its hunter-specific equipment and replacing it with the kind of cargo handling gear that any legitimate salvage operator would carry. The ship's identification codes were altered using techniques she'd learned from freight yard mechanics who occasionally needed to make their vessels harder to track. When she finally lifted off, leaving the crystal caves behind, the ship appeared to be exactly what its forged documentation claimed: an independent salvage vessel operated by a human trader named Sarah Chun, licensed for small-scale recovery operations throughout the Kepler sector. The first lead came from a fueling station on the edge of the Helix Nebula. Zara had been monitoring communication traffic while her ship's tanks were topped off, listening for the kind of coded messages that refugees might use to coordinate movements. What she found was better than coded messages. It was a human dock worker who asked too many questions about her cargo manifest and seemed unusually interested in her ship's sensor capabilities. His name was Marcus Webb, and he'd been helping Kithara refugees for almost 2 years. Started with one family. He told her over drinks in the station's bar, his voice carefully modulated to avoid carrying to nearby tables. Found them hiding in a derelict cargo container, half dead from starvation. Couldn't just turn them over to corporate security. Marcus had connections throughout the region. Dock workers, freight pilots, and station administrators who'd all encountered Kithra refugees at various times. Most had done what they could to help, providing food or medical supplies, or simply looking the other way when sensor readings didn't quite match official reports. But it's all small scale, Marcus admitted. Hiding one family here, sneaking medical supplies to another group there. We don't have the resources for anything bigger. What if someone provided those resources? Zara asked, and saw something change in the man's expression. Hope, mixed with the kind of desperate caution that came from fighting a losing battle for too long. Over the next week, Marcus introduced her to the informal network that had grown up around Kithra rescue efforts. There was Dr. Sarah Kim, a xenobiologist whose research station served as a secret way station for refugees traveling through the Cygnus Armed Commander Janet Torres, had been using her patrol ship to escort refugee vessels through corporate hunting zones, disguising the operations as routine military exercises. Most importantly, there was Father Miguel Santos, a human missionary whose religious order had declared the Kithra hunts to be an affront to basic morality. His network of churches and charitable organizations had been quietly supporting survivors throughout human space, providing everything from forged identification documents to safe houses where families could hide indefinitely. The corporate hunters think in terms of profit margins and resource extraction, Father Santos explained during a clandestine meeting in his chapel. They've never had to deal with a network motivated by moral outrage rather than financial gain. By the time Zara returned to the Crystal Caves, she carried contact information for 47 individuals scattered across 12 systems. Each of them had some capability that could contribute to a coordinated rescue operation: technical expertise, access to ships or stations, or simply the willingness to take enormous risks for people they'd never met. More importantly, she'd learned the locations of 6 additional survivor groups, ranging from a community of 30 individuals hiding in an asteroid mining complex to a single family living in the abandoned ruins of a failed colony world. It's not enough, Veth observed after reviewing the intelligence Zara had gathered. Even with human allies, we lack the military capability to assault heavily defended installations. We don't assault them, Zara replied, her hands already moving to build the device she'd been planning throughout her journey. We make them assault each other. The corporate communications network that coordinated hunter operations was heavily encrypted and theoretically secure. But Zara had something the corporations weren't expecting: detailed knowledge of their internal protocols gained from the captured ships, combined with access to Kithra biotechnology that could interface with computer systems in ways that purely electronic devices never could. The device she built was part signal generator, part computer virus, and part work of art. It could mimic corporate command codes with perfect accuracy, insert false data into shipping manifests, and, most importantly, alter the financial records that determined which facilities receive priority for supplies and security. If Processing Station Alpha suddenly shows a massive cost overrun in their quarterly reports, corporate headquarters will send an investigation team, she explained to the assembled group. If Station Beta reports that they've detected evidence of embezzlement by Station Alpha's management, the investigation becomes adversarial. And while they're fighting each other, Kef added, the young Kithra's understanding of human psychology growing more sophisticated by the day, their security will be focused inward instead of watching for external threats. Exactly. Corporate infighting is the one thing these facilities aren't designed to handle. They're set up to prevent rescues, not to deal with accusations of theft, fraud, and mismanagement coming from their own headquarters. Over the following month, Zara's device sent a carefully orchestrated series of false reports into the corporate network. Station Alpha reported discovering evidence that Station Beta was skimming profits by underreporting their biological resource yields. Station Beta responded with accusations that Alpha was inflating their operational costs through fraudulent supply contracts. The recriminations spread like wildfire through the corporate hierarchy. Audit teams were dispatched to investigate the allegations. Security personnel were reassigned to internal monitoring duties. Most importantly, the automated defenses that protected each facility were reduced to minimum levels as corporate executives focused on protecting themselves from their colleagues rather than external threats. When Zara finally launched the rescue operation, she did so with a network of 47 human allies, 12 Kithra refugees who'd volunteered to serve as guides and translators, and 17 different ships ranging from modified cargo haulers to a decommissioned military patrol vessel that Commander Torres had somehow acquired through channels she declined to explain. The first target was Processing Station Gamma, an isolated facility in the Barnard Star system that held approximately 200 Kithra prisoners. According to the corporate records, it was also the facility whose security chief had just been arrested on suspicion of embezzling medical supplies and selling them on the black market. The station's defenses were operating at 30% of normal capacity when Zara's strike force arrived. Their infiltration team, led by Dr. Kim and backed by modified hunter equipment, penetrated the facility's outer perimeter without triggering a single alarm. 6 hours later, 200 Kithra refugees were aboard evacuation ships bound for safe houses throughout human space. Processing Station Gamma's operational files had been completely corrupted. Its computer systems were infected with viruses that would take months to remove, and its staff had been left locked in their own detention cells with nothing but emergency rations and a note explaining that their biological resources had been liberated by beings who considered them people rather than commodities. It was the first successful rescue operation in the history of the Kithra genocide. It would not be the last. As Zara watched the evacuation ships disappear into faster-than-light travel, she felt the same certainty that had sustained her throughout the operation. This was bigger than engineering, more complex than any system she'd ever tried to fix. But the principles were the same. You identified what was broken, you gathered the tools and allies you needed, and you got to work. The corporate hunters had made the mistake of thinking that profit and fear were stronger than conscience and determination. They were about to discover just how wrong they could be. The corporate response was swift and brutal. Within 72 hours of the Processing Station Gamma raid, military contractors have been dispatched to every remaining facility. Emergency protocols were activated, increasing security to maximum levels and implementing shoot-on-sight orders for any unauthorized vessels. Most dangerously, corporate intelligence had begun a systematic investigation of recent supply chain disruptions, looking for patterns that might reveal the location of Zara's network. She received the warning from Father Santos, whose contacts in the shipping industry had noticed the sudden military buildup around corporate facilities. The message was brief and chilling. They know someone is coordinating the attacks. They're hunting the hunters now. Zara was aboard her modified hunter ship, en route to what was supposed to be the second target in their rescue campaign, when she received a communication. Processing Station Delta was located in a system so remote that its only claim to fame was serving as a waypoint for deep space exploration vessels. According to corporate records, it held nearly 400 Kithra prisoners and had been selected specifically because its isolation made rescue attempts seemingly impossible. Now, that same isolation had become a trap. Corporate security had correctly calculated that any rescue force would have to use the system's single hyperspace beacon to reach the station. All they had to do was wait. "How many ships?" she asked Marcus, who was serving as her communications coordinator for the mission. "6 heavy cruisers, plus escort vessels," came the reply. Full military complement, not the usual security contractors. Someone very high up the corporate chain authorized this response. Zara stared at the tactical display, showing enemy positions, calculating odds, and resources. Her strike force consisted of 17 ships, most of them converted civilian vessels with improvised weapons and defensive systems. Against military cruisers with professional crews and corporate-grade armaments, they didn't stand a chance in a direct confrontation, which was exactly what the corporations were counting on. "All ships, this is Zara," she broadcast on the encrypted frequency her network used. "Abort the Delta mission. Set course for the fallback coordinates and wait for new instructions." The protests came immediately. Commander Torres pointed out that they might not get another opportunity to hit such a large facility. Dr. Kim reminded her that 400 Kithra lives hung in the balance. Several of the civilian captains argued that they'd come too far to turn back now. They were all right, and they were all missing the point. The corporations want us to attack that station, Zara explained. They've turned it into bait, hoping we'll commit our entire force to a battle we can't win. If we do what they expect, this network dies today, and the rescue operations end permanently. So what do you suggest? Torres asked, her military training evident in the crisp professionalism of her voice. We can't just abandon those prisoners. We don't abandon them, Zara replied, a new plan already forming in her mind. We make the corporations abandon them instead. The strategy she outlined was more complex than anything they'd attempted before, requiring precise timing and the kind of coordinated deception that corporate security wasn't designed to handle. Instead of attacking the heavily defended station directly, they would attack the network that made its operation possible. Corporate hunting operations depended on a vast support infrastructure. Ships needed fuel, crews required provisions, and the biological processing equipment that made the entire operation profitable required constant maintenance and regular supply deliveries. Most importantly, the financial networks that funded the hunters were based on continuous communication with corporate headquarters, regular profit reports, and the kind of bureaucratic oversight that kept investors confident in their returns. If that infrastructure began failing simultaneously across multiple systems, even the most heavily defended facility would become untenable. Phase 1 begins in 6 hours, Zara announced her network. Every supply convoy, every communication relay, every corporate office with ties to hunter operations becomes a target. We're not just rescuing prisoners anymore. We're burning down the entire industry. The first strikes targeted the supply chains. Marcus led a team of dock workers in sabotaging fuel deliveries at 3 major stations, introducing contaminants that would cause engine failures in any ship attempting faster-than-light travel. Dr. Kim used her research credentials to gain access to medical supply warehouses, where her team introduced biological agents that would contaminate the specialized preservation equipment used in processing facilities. Father Santos proved to be particularly effective at coordinating attacks on corporate communications networks. His religious order had contacts throughout human space, including several individuals with technical expertise in electronic warfare. Within 12 hours, 7 major communication relays had suffered accidental failures that left hunter fleets operating in complete isolation from their corporate sponsors. But the most devastating attacks came from an unexpected source, the Kithra themselves. Kef had spent weeks studying the corporate computer systems captured from the hunter ships, learning to interface with human technology using the same biological processes that made their healing abilities possible. The young Kithra discovered that their species' bioelectric capabilities could interact with electronic systems in ways that pure technology never could, essentially allowing them to heal computer networks by correcting errors and conflicts in their programming. They could also do the reverse. Working with Veth and 2 other adult Kithra, Kef developed what they called digital poison, carefully crafted data corruption that could spread through corporate networks like an infection, gradually degrading system performance until critical failures became inevitable. Unlike normal computer viruses, which could be detected and eliminated by security software, their bioelectric intrusion was essentially undetectable to purely electronic monitoring systems. It's not destruction, Kef explained to Zara through their touch communication link. It's more like introducing illness into a healthy organism. The systems don't fail immediately, but they become progressively less reliable until they can no longer function. The first corporate facility to experience complete system failure was a processing station in the Vega Nebula. Its life support systems began producing atmospheric imbalances, its security networks started reporting false intrusions, and its financial tracking software began generating random errors that made profit calculations impossible. Within 24 hours, corporate headquarters had declared the facility operationally unsustainable and ordered an evacuation. 300 Kithara prisoners were transferred to other stations, but the chaos of the emergency evacuation allowed nearly 50 individuals to escape during transport. Similar failures began cascading through the corporate network. Stations that had operated flawlessly for years suddenly found their equipment degrading, their supply deliveries contaminated, and their communication links unreliable. Insurance companies began refusing to cover facilities that couldn't demonstrate basic operational competency. Corporate investors demanded investigations into the sudden spike in operational failures. Most importantly, the military cruisers guarding Processing Station Delta were recalled to protect higher priority targets that seemed to be under more immediate threat. "Now we move," Zara announced, and her strike force finally began its approach to the Delta system. They found the station defended by a skeleton crew, its automated defenses operating at minimum levels, while its command staff dealt with the same system failures that were plaguing facilities throughout corporate space. The infiltration team penetrated the facility's perimeter without triggering a single alarm, and the actual rescue operation took less than 3 hours. 418 Kithara refugees were evacuated to safety, along with complete copies of the station's operational files and prisoner records. But more importantly, they'd proven that the corporate hunting network was far more vulnerable than anyone had realized. They built this entire operation around the assumption that their victims couldn't fight back, Zara observed as she watched the evacuation ships disappear into hyperspace. They never considered what would happen if someone gave the Kithara allies who understood their technology. The corporate response to the Delta raid was even more extreme than their reaction to the first rescue. Military fleets were deployed to protect every remaining processing station. Corporate security began conducting raids on stations and settlements where Kithara sympathizers were suspected of operating. Most ominously, they'd started hiring mercenary companies with reputations for brutal efficiency, paying premium rates for crews willing to ask no questions about their targets. But they'd also made a critical strategic error. In their desperation to protect their remaining assets, they'd concentrated their forces around a small number of heavily defended installations, abandoning the distributed network that had made their hunting operations so effective. "They're thinking like a corporation under attack," Commander Torres observed during a strategy meeting in Father Santos's chapel. "Consolidating resources, protecting core assets, minimizing exposure to further losses. It's exactly what military doctrine would recommend. And exactly what we want them to do," Zara agreed. "Concentrated forces are vulnerable to coordinated attacks. More importantly, they've abandoned the outer systems where most of the remaining survivor groups are hiding." Over the following weeks, her network conducted 17 rescue operations in systems that corporate security had declared too remote to defend. Each operation followed the same pattern. Identify a survivor group through the refugee network, coordinate with local human allies to provide support and transportation, and evacuate everyone to safe houses and regions where corporate influence was minimal. By the end of the month, they'd rescued nearly 1,500 Kithara refugees, completely disrupted the corporate supply chain, and inflicted financial losses that had caused 3 major hunting corporations to declare bankruptcy. More importantly, they'd proven something that the galaxy's power brokers had never considered possible. Humans were willing to fight for principles rather than profit, and when they chose to fight, they were very good at it. The final battle came at Corporate Processing Station Alpha, the largest and most heavily defended facility in the hunting network. Located in a fortified system near corporate headquarters, it held over 800 Kithara prisoners and served as the primary research facility where new biological processing techniques were developed. It was also the symbolic heart of the entire operation. If Alpha fell, the corporate hunting industry would collapse completely. The executives running the operation knew this, which was why they'd concentrated their remaining military assets around the station and issued standing orders to defend it at any cost. "They have 43 ships," Torres reported, studying intelligence gathered by reconnaissance drones, heavy cruisers, battle frigates, and enough escort vessels to screen against any conceivable attack. The station itself is equipped with military-grade defensive systems and protected by overlapping energy shields. It's impossible, Dr. Kim added bluntly. Even if we had military support from human government forces, which we don't, the odds would be overwhelming. Zara studied the tactical data, calculating defensive positions and weapon ranges with the same systematic approach she'd used for engineering problems. The corporate forces were positioned perfectly to repel any direct assault, their overlapping fields of fire covering every possible approach vector. They prepared for every conventional attack scenario, which meant it was time to try something unconventional. "We're not going to attack the station," she announced, and saw the confusion in her allies' faces. "We're going to make them destroy it themselves." The plan she outlined was the most audacious deception yet attempted. Instead of directly assaulting the heavily defended facility, they would convince the corporate defenders that their own allies were planning to betray them. Using the digital poison techniques developed by Kef and the other Kithra, they would introduce subtle corruptions into the corporate communication networks. False intelligence reports suggesting that certain military contractors were planning to seize the station for themselves. Financial records indicating that competing corporations were sabotaging each other's operations. Communication intercepts that appeared to show coordinated attacks being planned by forces that were supposedly on the same side. "Corporate paranoia will do the work for us," Zara explained. "These people already don't trust each other. They're only working together because the profits are too big to ignore. If we can convince them that their allies are actually enemies, they'll tear each other apart." The operation required 3 weeks of careful preparation. False evidence had to be crafted with perfect precision, introduced into corporate networks gradually enough to seem authentic. Timing had to be coordinated across multiple systems to ensure that accusations and counter-accusations reached their targets simultaneously. When the deception finally triggered, the results exceeded even Zara's optimistic projections. Corporate security forces began investigating each other for evidence of embezzlement and sabotage. Military contractors started positioning their ships to defend against attacks from supposed allies rather than external threats. 3 different corporate executives issued contradictory orders to the same military units, creating a command structure so confused that nobody was certain who they were supposed to be taking orders from. The final trigger was a forged communication suggesting that one of the military contractors was planning to seize control of Processing Station Alpha and sell its prisoners to a competing corporation. The message was delivered simultaneously to 4 different corporate security chiefs, each of whom believed they were the only ones who knew about the supposed betrayal. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, 38 of the 43 defending ships had been destroyed or disabled by their own allies. Processing Station Alpha's defensive shields had been brought down by friendly fire from corporate security forces attempting to prevent their supposed betrayal. The station itself was heavily damaged and completely unable to maintain its biological processing operations. Most importantly, 837 Kithra prisoners were evacuated to safety while their captors fought each other for control of a facility that was no longer worth controlling. As Zara watched the last evacuation ship disappear into hyperspace, she felt something she'd never experienced before: the satisfaction of having completely solved a problem that had seemed impossible. The corporate hunting network was finished, its leadership in chaos, its military assets destroyed, and its financial backers fleeing to avoid association with the disaster. But more than that, she'd helped an entire species reclaim hope for their future. The scattered Kithra refugees were no longer isolated survivors hiding from hunters. They were a people who'd been given the chance to rebuild, protected by human allies who'd proven that some principles were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. "What happens now?" Kef asked as they stood together on the observation deck of their command ship, watching the remains of Processing Station Alpha drift in the void. Now we start the real work, Zara replied, her mind already turning to the challenges ahead. Helping your people find new homes, establishing safe colonies where you can live without fear, building a future where the Kithra and humans work together instead of one species preying on another. It would be a massive undertaking requiring years of effort and resources they didn't currently have. But Zara had learned something important during the rescue operations. When humans decided to fix something, they had a remarkable ability to find ways to make impossible solutions work. The Kithra had been saved. Now it was time to help them thrive. 2 years after the fall of Processing Station Alpha, the planet Kethra bloomed with life that defied every law of ecological development. Zara stood on the observation platform of the New Haven Colony's central complex, watching Kithra children play in gardens that had been barren rock only 18 months earlier. Their laughter carried on the morning breeze, a sound that would have been impossible during the dark years of the hunting campaigns. The planet itself had been a corporate write-off, a failed terraforming project abandoned when initial biological surveys showed soil too depleted to support conventional agriculture. The corporation that owned the development rights had been happy to sell them to Father Santos's refugee relief organization for a fraction of the original investment, especially after their involvement in the Hunter Network had made any association with Kithra-related activities a public relations nightmare. What the corporate surveyors had failed to understand was that Kithra didn't require conventional agriculture. Their healing abilities worked on ecosystems as effectively as on individual organisms, and a community of motivated healers could restore damaged environments in ways that purely technological solutions never could. The Eastern Valley is ready for the next wave of settlers, reported Dr. Sarah Kim, joining Zara on the platform with a tablet full of environmental readings. Soil composition is optimal, atmospheric processors are running at full efficiency, and the aquifer system is producing more fresh water than we projected. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. What began as scattered groups of refugees living in temporary shelters had evolved into a thriving community of nearly 4,000 individuals. Humans and Kithra worked side by side in integrated teams, combining technological expertise with biological healing to accomplish feats of environmental restoration that neither species could have managed alone. Any word from the Galactic Council? Zara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Kim's expression darkened slightly. Still under review. The Committee on Interspecies Rights has been debating the Kithra protection proposal for 14 months. Apparently, there are concerns about setting precedents for economic disruption in the name of humanitarian intervention. The political situation remained frustratingly complex. While the corporate hunting network had been destroyed, the legal frameworks that had enabled it remained largely intact. Galactic commerce law still classified the Kithra as exploitable biological resources in many jurisdictions, and several governments had expressed concern about the economic implications of granting them full sentient rights. Bureaucracy, Zara muttered, a sentiment that Dr. Kim obviously shared. Sometimes I think the galaxy would work better if we put engineers in charge instead of politicians. Speaking of engineers, Kim said, brightening considerably, the new arrivals from the Kepler sector have some impressive technical backgrounds. 3 starship designers, 2 industrial architects, and someone who claims to be an expert in biomechanical integration. They're asking specifically for you. Zara wasn't surprised. Word of the Kithra rescue operations had spread throughout human space, and New Haven had become a symbol of what was possible when different species worked together. Engineers, scientists, and idealists from across the galaxy had been arriving on every transport, eager to contribute to what many considered the most successful interspecies cooperation project in recorded history. She found the new arrivals in the Orientation Center, a mixed group of humans and 3 other species who'd come to lend their expertise to the colony's development. The Kithra refugees had taught their rescuers an important lesson. The galaxy contained many species who'd been marginalized, exploited, or threatened by corporate interests, and Humans willing to fight for justice were welcome allies regardless if it was being threatened. "I'm looking for the mechanic who started all this," announced a tall woman with the kind of precise posture that suggested military training. Commander Elena Vasquez, formerly of the Terran Deep Space Engineering Corps. "I brought some friends who thought you might be able to use their help." The friends turned out to be a remarkable collection of individuals. Dr. Tomas Rivera was a biomechanical engineer who'd spent years developing prosthetics that could interface with non-human physiology. Angela Chun specialized in sustainable technology systems designed for harsh environments. Most intriguingly, there was Kuri Okonkwo, a former corporate security specialist who became disgusted with his employer's treatment of non-human species and decided to switch sides. "We've been following your work," Commander Vasquez explained as they toured the colony's central facilities. "The way you combined human technology with Kithra biological capabilities to break the hunter network. It was brilliant, and it's got people thinking about other applications." They paused beside one of the colony's most impressive achievements, a living building where Kithra architectural techniques had been combined with human engineering to create structures that literally grew from modified plant matter. The walls were self-repairing, the internal climate was regulated by biological processes, and the entire building continued to evolve and adapt to the needs of its inhabitants. "This is just the beginning," Dr. Rivera observed, running his hands along a wall that pulsed gently with bioelectric energy. "The potential for human-Kithra cooperation goes far beyond refugee assistance. We could be looking at revolutionary advances in medicine, environmental restoration, even space exploration." "That's the plan," Zara agreed. "But first we have to make sure the Kithra survive long enough to be partners instead of victims." The threat hadn't entirely disappeared. While the major corporate hunting operations have been dismantled, smaller groups continued to operate in remote systems, targeting isolated families and individuals who couldn't reach the protection of established colonies. Moreover, several governments had begun expressing interest in developing their own Kithra programs, using diplomatic language to disguise what were essentially nationalized versions of the same exploitation. "Which is why we're here," Carice said bluntly. "You've proven that the hunters can be beaten, but you've also proven that humans are willing to fight for non-human rights. That makes enemies as well as allies." He was right, of course. The success of the Kithra rescue operations had sent shockwaves through the galactic power structure. Corporate interests that had profited from the hunting network were actively working to undermine New Haven and similar colonies. Several military contractors were openly recruiting for security operations in systems where Kithra refugees were known to be hiding. Most ominously, intelligence reports suggested that some governments were considering preemptive action to prevent other species from receiving the same kind of human protection that the Kithra had found. "They're scared," Commander Vasquez observed with obvious satisfaction. "For the first time in centuries, humans have demonstrated that we're willing to fight for something other than profit or territorial expansion. That changes the entire balance of galactic politics." The conversation was interrupted by Kef, now 14 years old and serving as one of the colony's primary liaisons between human and Kithra communities. The young refugee had grown into their role with remarkable grace, developing diplomatic skills that allowed them to navigate complex negotiations while never losing sight of their people's needs. "Zara," they said, their standard now fluent enough to handle complex technical discussions. "We have visitors. 3 ships requesting permission to land. They're claiming to be a diplomatic mission from the Galactic Council." The tone in Kef's voice suggested that their empathic abilities had detected something troubling about the visitors' intentions. Zara felt her hands automatically drift toward the plasma cutter she still carried, a habit left over from the hunting war. "How many people?" she asked, already moving toward the communication center. 47 individuals. Mixed species, but the senior officials are all from governments that oppose the Kithra protection proposal. Kef paused, their antennae twitching with the concentration that accompanied deep empathic reading. "They're afraid, but not of us. They're afraid of what we represent." The diplomatic mission turned out to be exactly what Zara had suspected. A fact-finding expedition designed to gather intelligence on New Haven's capabilities while simultaneously pressuring the colony to accept restrictions on its activities. The senior diplomat, a Terran Council representative named Director Walsh, made it clear that several governments were concerned about the precedent of independent rescue operations. While we all applaud the humanitarian goals of this colony, Walsh explained during the formal reception, there are legitimate concerns about the long-term implications of unregulated interspecies cooperation. The economic disruption caused by your actions against lawful corporate entities has created significant instability in several sectors. Lawful? Dr. Kim interrupted with obvious disgust. They were committing genocide for profit. The legal classification of Kithara individuals remains under review, Walsh replied smoothly. However, the methods used to disrupt their operations violated numerous treaties regarding corporate property rights and military engagement protocols. Zara listened to the diplomatic double-talk with growing irritation. These people had come here to find ways to shut down the rescue operations, to force the Kithara back into hiding while bureaucrats debated whether they deserved basic rights to survival. Let me make something clear, she said, cutting through Walsh's prepared statement. This colony exists because humans decided that some things are more important than legal technicalities and corporate profits. We're not going to abandon that principle because it makes politicians uncomfortable. MS. Kowalski, Walsh replied, his tone becoming noticeably cooler. You're operating under the protection of the Terran Colonial Charter, which grants significant autonomy to development colonies. However, that protection extends only to lawful activities conducted within recognized territorial boundaries. Activities that extend beyond those boundaries, particularly activities that interfere with legitimate commercial operations, fall under different legal frameworks. The threat was clear enough. The Galactic Council was prepared to revoke New Haven's colonial protections if the rescue operations continued. Without legal recognition, the colony would become vulnerable to corporate retaliation, government intervention, or simple abandonment by the supply networks that kept them connected to galactic civilization. How long do we have? Commander Vasquez asked quietly. The review process will take approximately 6 months, Walsh replied. During that time, we strongly recommend that all extraterritorial activities be suspended pending final determination of this colony's legal status. After the diplomatic mission departed, Zara called a meeting of the colony's senior leadership. The stakes had changed fundamentally. Instead of fighting corporate hunters, they were now facing a political battle that could determine the future of human-alien cooperation throughout the galaxy. They want us to choose between survival and principles, Father Santos observed. Stop the rescue operations, and they'll allow the colony to exist. Continue helping refugee groups, and they'll shut us down completely. It's not that simple, Kree added. If we stop the rescues, other governments will see it as proof that humans can be pressured into abandoning non-human allies. Every species that's currently considering whether to trust human protection will decide it's safer to make deals with their exploiters instead. The debate continued for hours, but Zara had already made her decision. She'd started this effort as a stranded mechanic trying to help one injured child. It had evolved into something larger than any of them had originally imagined, but the core principle remained the same. Some things were too important to abandon, regardless of the cost. We continue the rescues, she announced, but we also prepare for what comes next. Over the following months, New Haven transformed itself from a refugee colony into the headquarters of what historians would later call the Interspecies Protection Alliance. The network of human allies that had enabled the Kithara rescues expanded to include representatives from dozens of species who'd suffered under corporate exploitation or government oppression. More importantly, they began sharing the techniques that had made their operations successful. The biodigital integration methods developed by Kef and the other Kithara were taught to allies throughout the galaxy, creating a technological advantage that corporate and government forces weren't prepared to counter. When the Galactic Council finally moved to revoke New Haven's colonial protections, They discovered that the human colony had become something unprecedented, the center of a multi-species alliance that was capable of defending itself. They wanted to force us to choose between survival and principles, Zara observed as she watched Allied ships take defensive positions around the colony. Instead, they've given us the chance to prove that the two aren't mutually exclusive. The confrontation that followed was brief and decisive. Corporate security forces, accustomed to bullying isolated refugee groups, found themselves facing coordinated resistance from species they'd never expected to work together. Government military units discovered that their conventional tactics were useless against opponents who could disrupt electronic systems through biological processes. Most importantly, the galaxy's power brokers learned that humans were capable of inspiring loyalty in other species, not through conquest or economic domination, but through the simple act of keeping their promises to defend those who couldn't defend themselves. Kef found Zara in her workshop 3 days after the last corporate ship had withdrawn from the system. The young Kithra had grown into a remarkable individual, serving as both diplomat and healer while never losing the curiosity that had first brought them to trust a strange human mechanic. The Council of Worlds has agreed to meet with our alliance, Kef reported. 47 species have formally requested membership, and the preliminary negotiations are scheduled for next month. Worried about becoming a politician? Zara asked with a grin. Terrified, Kef admitted, but also hopeful. For the first time since the hunting began, my people aren't just surviving. We're building something that might outlast all of us. Through the workshop's windows, they could see Kithara children playing with human youngsters in gardens that bloomed with impossible beauty. The site was exactly what Zara had been working towards since that first night, when she'd found an injured refugee and decided that some broken things were worth fixing regardless of how difficult the repair might be. The real work is just beginning, she said, her hands already moving toward the next project on her workbench. Building a galaxy where different species can work together instead of preying on each other. It's going to be the biggest engineering challenge any of us has ever faced. But you think it's possible? Kef asked. Zara looked out at the thriving colony, the Allied ships, and the children who were growing up in a world where cooperation was stronger than